Now, for myself and Sarah, there are two focal lengths that we can't live without. These are the 28mm and the 50mm. We use both focal lengths extensively in our work, but we use them in completely different ways. So in this video, I'm going to be exploring our two approaches. I'm going to be looking at our different thought processes and techniques, and I'll give you some practical ideas to help you get the best from these two very popular focal lengths. Now, those of you that have been following the channel for any length of time will know that Sarah's favourite focal length is 28mm. She's had the same Leica 28mm lens for over a decade now, and the majority of her photographic output has been with that lens. She didn't pick up the 28mm because her favourite photographers were using it. In fact, I don't think any of Sarah's favourite photographers actually use a 28mm. It was more a case of her trying it out one day and then realising that the field of view was exactly how she saw the world. But 5 years or so ago now, she started to introduce 50mm into her project work, and honestly, she hasn't really looked back since. Now, I'm kind of the other way around, I guess. And for over 30 years, I used the 50mm for the majority of my photographic output, but it's only in recent years that I've introduced 28mm into my work. What's interesting about Sarah and the 28 is that when she works with a 28, she doesn't tend to use it as a wide angle. She uses it like many photographers would use a 50mm. She uses it as a standard lens. Her approach has always been very observational. She doesn't get too close to the subject in terms of distance, and her photographs don't always exhibit that kind of classic wide angle look. Now, when she's composing her images, she tends to favour the middle and background, with most of the interest in the middle ground. It's kind of rare that she wants something to be in the foreground like you would do with a wide angle lens. She doesn't like the idea of something dominating the photograph. You know, she likes to be able to have things equally proportioned in the photograph as far as she can. Now, she likes that wide angle field of view, that 28mm field of view. You know, when you look through the frame, you can see edge to edge, that distance, if you like. That's what she likes. But she's not that keen on the way that a wide angle distorts the subject, particularly from foreground to background. My approach is completely opposite to hers. I use 28mm as a wide angle. I like to get close, and I like to accentuate that kind of immersive feeling that a wide angle lens gives me. It's almost like a special effects lens. You know, it distorts reality in some ways, and I like to dominate the foreground with the subject. I like to work a lot closer to the subject than Sarah does, which has almost been grounds for divorce when we've been out on the street together and I've stepped in front of her photograph to get my picture. But we won't dwell on that. We'll move swiftly along. We also differ when it comes to focusing the lens. Sarah manually focuses the lens, and I rely on zone focusing nearly all of the time with the 28mm. For me, one of the huge advantages to wide angle lenses is being able to use zone focusing, but Sarah will often shoot wide open, and so manually focusing has become second nature to her. And if you see her work, you can see how quick she is with achieving focus. Now, a quick tip: if you want to focus like Sarah, try and get used to working at a particular distance, at least as a starting point. Most photographers who spend a lot of time with prime lenses tend to find themselves working at a similar distance to the subject every time that they take pictures. For Sarah with the 28mm, this is about 12 feet away. So she sets the distance scale on the lens to 12 feet so that she's in the ballpark, so that when she brings the camera to her eye, any refinement of the focus is going to be very quick and easy to do. Using the 28mm for Sarah is a very deliberate, very controlled way of shooting, whereas for me, it's far more random and far more haphazard. Now, when it comes to the 50mm, we use the focal length very differently. For me, 50mm is a focal length which lends itself to a more voyeuristic style of picture, I guess. I always feel like I'm looking at the picture rather than being part of it. When I shoot with the 50mm, my pictures naturally become more considered. They're nowhere near as haphazard as they are with the 28mm. They're less reactionary to some extent. It's a lens I enjoy for arranging visual elements within the scene. I don't use the lens to come in tight on the subject. In fact, I use it the opposite way. I tend to use the 50mm to give me some distance from the subject. You know, I actually frame a lot tighter and fill the frame more with a 28mm. I also like to shoot colour with the 50mm. The narrower field of view helps to accentuate colour in the frame. You know, 28mm at times can almost overload the frame if there's a lot of colour information within the scene. The other thing I like to do is shoot with a small aperture. It gives the lens a very natural look. You've got a natural perspective within the lens, and by stopping down so that we see the photograph as the eye would see it, gives a very undistorted look. Now in contrast, Sarah approaches the 50 like I would approach a telephoto. If you think about it for a second, Sarah's normal is 28mm, so 50mm to her is going to feel like using a telephoto lens. Sarah uses the 50mm lens to come in really tight on the subject, and to isolate it. In her world of 28mm, there's lots of information within the frame, so the 50mm allows her to concentrate on one thing, and she also likes to shoot wide open when she's using the lens. So this tighter perspective and wider aperture gives her images a much more intimate feel, I guess. She gets a level of connection with the people in her photographs with the 50mm, which I just don't. Now, when it comes to framing, again, we use the 50mm completely differently. Because Sarah works with the lens wide open, and these days she's using the Not Deluxe, and wide open is basically f1, she places the subject closer to the center of the frame than I would. And this is to avoid any softness around the edges of the frame. Now, I'm happy to take the subject right to the edge of the frame and stop the 50mm down. I also like to fill the frame with multiple things with a 50mm. It's part of the game I play in trying to get lots of different elements within the frame and having their own space within that frame. But this is what Sarah does with the 28mm. Sarah uses the 28mm lens as a standard lens, as I would use a 50mm. Now, one tip I learned very early on in my career is that when it comes to framing with a 50mm lens, if you want more foreground interest, foreground is hard to get with a 50mm lens. But if you want to get things that look like they're dominant in the foreground, shoot vertically. Turn your camera 90 degrees and shoot vertically. It will give the impression of having much more foreground depth. And there isn't any distortion with that lens, so you won't get a weird looking perspective as you would do with a wide angle, for example, turned vertically. Now, when it comes to focusing, I still rely on zone focusing when I can, but oftentimes that's quite difficult to do with the 50mm. So I'll focus normally through the viewfinder. Quick tip here when it comes to focusing something like a 50mm lens, it can be quite challenging, especially if the subject is moving. Sometimes it's just easier to bring the camera up to the eye, focus once, and then move with the subject, move backwards and forwards or side to side. It's easier to do that than it is to try and keep focusing on the subject while they're moving. Alternatively, if the subject is moving towards you or side to side in one direction and pretty much where they're going to be, focus on a predetermined point which you think they're going to reach. Wait for them to reach that point before pressing the shutter. Another area where we differ is when it comes to choosing a lens model within a focal length. Lens character is very important to Sarah. Her 28mm SilverChrome from the late 90s gives a very unique look to the photograph. The vignetting in particular is quite strong, and while a lot of photographers would try and remove it, Sarah sees it as being part of the lens character, and woe betide me if I decide I'm going to take the vignetting out of her photographs. I'm in real trouble. I'm just not allowed to do that. I have to keep those photographs as the lens saw them. Sarah's 50mm Not Deluxe wide open is beautiful and quite unique in terms of camera lenses, but there's a cost. The lens is huge, it's heavy, it's slow to focus, and it also blocks about a third of the viewfinder when you're using it. Now, Sarah is happy to work with those problems because of the way it renders the subject. Now, I love the Not Deluxe. It's the reason I bought into the Leica system many years ago. It was the very first Leica lens that I ever bought. But today, I just want my lenses to be as small and as light as possible and really easy to focus. Now, with my little 50mm SilverChrome, I can achieve focus really quickly. The lens barrel is tiny, and by using the infinity stop technique, which I mentioned in a previous video, which I'll link to at the end of this one, I don't ever feel that I need autofocus. And finally, the subjects that we choose to photograph with the lenses also differs. I'm shooting a lot of street photography now with the 50mm and a lot of my pictorial work. But Sarah has used 50mm maybe once, I guess, on the street. I can remember ever using it once. She just feels it cuts into that field of view which she likes to see. 28mm is really her lens for street. Her projects, however, are littered with 50mm images. She enjoys the lens in a controlled environment when she can use the lens's characteristics to add something different to her work. If she's working on a project, the 50mm lens just adds something completely different to her work. We're two different photographers and we approach the two different focal lengths very differently as we approach everything in our photographic life. A wide angle for me is a standard lens for Sarah, and standard for me is a telephoto for Sarah. I see the wide angle as an effects lens, and she sees the 50mm as an effects lens. But ultimately, the success of each focal length depends on the photographer. It depends on their eye and not the focal length itself. Thanks for watching. If you want to know more about the 50mm and the 28mm, we have a couple of videos which I'll link to shortly at the end of this video. If you use 50 and 28, let me know in the comments what you think about them. You know, which one do you prefer? And until next time, take care and I'll see you soon.